I'm Lynn, and this is a presentation on transfeminism in Japan. One of the first things we need to go over is the context. That is that transfeminism is a feminism of intersections. Common issues such as economic class, social standing, and sexuality can compound with transfeminism to make it harder to socially and medically transition, as well as make it less socially acceptable to exist as a trans identity in the first place. And this kind of compounds with the fact that due to being seen as more extreme or more deviant from the norm, transfeminism is often thrown under the bus, so to speak, by more mainstream movements, or even attacked by feminist movements as a sort of play on turfery and transphobia. And so these contexts are important to keep in mind when we're looking at transfeminism, and also a reason why we look into it in the first place, as it can be important to understand and when looking at a whole and complete picture of feminist movements in Japan and also the world at large, and kind of how they tie together and how different factors influence transgender individuals and trans feminist movements, and also how these movements interact with each other. And this is specific to Japan, and also specific to, as I said, the world at large, which is really something we have to consider when considering transfeminism, is because in modernity, it's kind of, a lot has happened in the last 30 years, and that includes the internet, which is where a lot of transphobic and transfeminist debates, discussions, activism is being held, being performed. And so we can have kind of trans ideologies being brought up in the US and the UK, being transported over to Japan, and vice versa. And so a lot of this isn't a nation-specific issue or discussion, it's a global one. And so when talking about Japan, we will have to bring in transfeminist pieces and quotes and movements from outside of Japan, such as the UK. Specifically, transphobic movements in Britain have existed and been transported to a lot of the rest of the world via social media, specifically Japan, in addition to other places in Europe and the US. But a lot of tropes and ideas that originate in the UK can then be kind of spread out. And one thing in specific was the hashtag #MeToo movement, which happened earlier in the 2010s, that started in the West and kind of eventually circulated to Japanese language Twitter, which is overall a positive movement. However, it was also co-opted in some part by TERFs, that is trans exclusionary radical feminists, to be used as a weapon against trans women who are seen as invading women's spaces, or predators, or kind of predating on women, which is a common trope in the West, at least, that seems to have percolated into Japan through these global means of communication. This is a quote taken from a writing by a Japanese feminist author, Shimizu. And this is how we have tropes such as, I don't know if you're familiar with the film Silence of the Lambs, but you have tropes such as embodied by the character of Buffalo Bill being brought into the Japanese cultural kind of forefront, tropes that originated in the West and are brought into Japan, and so we must consider them when we are talking about Japanese transfeminism, especially in the modern day. And thinking about that kind of brings us into the Japanese focus on this, which, while in many places, or like many places, Japan has a history of cross-dressing that goes back hundreds of years, although in modern times, this was kind of brought back up in the 90s with the reclassification of GID, or gender identity disorder, by the Japanese medical authority, which kind of let it become a little bit more open to the mainstream, because there was actually something it could be classified as, which in and of itself was a bit of an issue, because the 90s reclassification did not include X-gender, which is somewhat analogous to what we would in the West call either intersex or non-binary people, but it isn't a one-to-one correlation. So even binary transgender identities were not, even though those were accepted to a certain degree, the full spectrum of trans existence was not. And that is something we also have to acknowledge when moving forward, is that the trans identity is not a binary one. It's bimodal. That's a whole different thing. It doesn't fit so cleanly into that distinction. And so that's important to think about when we're talking about transfeminism in Japan. And so that kind of takes us moving forward, is a lot of these things are, again, imported from the other countries, and this is what we have to think about. So these ideas on sex and gender identity, something we see is that, again, the term itself, transgender, as an identity category, is relatively new to the Japanese context. This is in an article from the Oxford University Post Journal on Asian Studies by Mitsuhashi Drenko, is that while this idea of cross-dressing and non-gender conformity did exist, it's still recent. And this kind of also ties into more recent population concerns that the Japanese conservative people and government hold, that due to declining fertility rates, the younger generations are kind of responsible to remedy this issue. And this means that people not having children for a variety of reasons, not just trans people or LGBTQ people, but just even economic ones, are being pressured by the conservative government. And this is kind of another way that we see intersections arise, is that trans people in Japan and lesbian gay people in Japan as well can kind of be blamed for societal factors that are not at all their fault, and then issues that are caused by development of the country and by economics. If you don't have enough money to settle down and start a family, you're not going to settle down and start a family, are kind of being laid into trans and LGBTQ issues in Japan. The declining fertility rate, trans people aren't having biological children, or once they get far enough in their transition, at least they aren't, and this is kind of used against them. And so we see in another quote by a different article in the Oxford English Press, is that the existence of these identities that aren't, having biological children is part of a governmental concern, and this opens them up to additional attack just for existing because, they're not having kids, which ties into other feminist ideas of, people exist for more things than to just have kids. And again, we see that this started roughly in the latter half of the 20th century, which kind of ties into the more modern and contemporary aspects of transfeminism as a movement, as an ideology, as an issue that is spoken about even adjacent to the mainstream, let alone the mainstream itself. And that's actually brings up an interesting topic, is that a lot of this, again, along lines of intersection, can be more ascribed to economic factors than to sex, sexuality, and gender factors. Is that, as a simple fact of a nation developing, their population growth just slows, and so this thing that is just natural to civilizations. We've seen it in the U.S., we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in Europe, we're seeing it currently in developing nations right now. It turns out when kids don't die from being breathed on, you don't need to have as many, because they will generally survive to adulthood, and that's just an interesting factor that gets lumped in against feminism and transfeminism, that you have to have kids, but not anymore in a modern society. And this also kind of brings us into some reflections we can make on transfeminism in Japan, is that, again, it's very intersectional, it's very contemporary, and it's very connected with the outside world. It's not just a Japanese issue, it's a global one. that kind of connects through a global movement with the unique Japanese context, and that's why it's so important and interesting. Is that it is something that reflects Japan in the rest of the world and reflects the rest of the world in Japan, through how these movements originate and move around the globe. And that kind of leads us into what conclusions we can make about transfeminism and what discussions we can have, or what conclusions we can each make personally, and discussions we can have on those conclusions. Is that it's kind of a interesting thing to bring in. You can tie it to almost any other discussion that you have on feminism as a kind of category. It's got global progress. Again, I have said this so many times, and I will repeat saying this because it is important, is that this isn't something that's just limited to Japan. It's brought into Japan from other countries. It's brought into other countries from Japan. It's primarily online. It's done through the internet. It's done through social media. This is its own wave of feminism that we see, and that makes it very open to contribute to. But it also means that the counterpoints, the reactions to this, happen online as well, which present their own unique challenges. It means that transphobic and just anti-feminist ideas in general can kind of perpetuate themselves on the internet, and how they intersect with other categories of who has access to the internet, who has access to high-speed internet, who has access to different social media networks that interact with different nations' laws differently. And so it's a whole thing. And I do look forward to everybody's answers to this discussion. And these are the works cited and image sources. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day.